Hegel takes a kind of different approach here. I don't know if you noticed this when you read it. It's sometimes hard to figure out when Hegel is mired in technical progressions and unpacking something that's already there, and when he's really stepping back. But here, it seems to me, it's pretty clear at the beginning of the reciprocity chapter, which, by the way, reciprocity of action, Wechselberg, and I don't know where the of action came from, so it's just reciprocity. It's the title of the chapter. Title of the section. So anyway, at the beginning of that, Hegel steps back. He says, in finite causality. So that's pretty indicative of Hegel saying, look, let's still do the comparative work of where we've been, right, and see what's going on thus far. So he begins the analysis of reciprocity by drawing a distinction, a comparison really, between finite causality and what he's going to call reciprocity here. He says, finite causality occurs when a substance transposes or communicates its power to its effect, and this effect is in another substance. He calls that the externality of causality. And so this is where you get the bad infinite problem. Right? So this is where we're familiar with this, we know what he's talking about. But then he says, and he calls that a kind of mechanism. Right? So he's already backing out. We all know this, we're all familiar with this, right? That's what classical billiard ball mechanism is all about. And it runs into the infinity problem that we've laid out there. But then he says reciprocity occurs when two things happen. Reciprocity occurs when the causal substance disappears in its power of producing an effect, which we've heard a lot about already, right? Just the cause just is what it is in producing the effect. And secondly, the cause comes to be precisely in and through this disappearing, this negating itself, mediating itself into the effect. Now, he's argued for both of those, right? That reciprocity is unlike finite causality because it's not about one thing causing another thing, causing another thing, causing another thing progressively, or what caused this to cause this to cause this. That's the infinite regress. He's saying reciprocity is where the cause literally exhausts itself, disappears in the effect. There's nothing more left over afterwards. And it actually becomes itself by doing that. It becomes cause. That's what a cause is. It's nothing other than that. Now, having drawn that distinction, that's what he does in the very first paragraph here. In the second paragraph now, begins at first the reciprocity. Reciprocity takes on the form of reciprocal causality. He more closely examines what reciprocity is. So now he's talking about reciprocity. He returns in particular to the point he made in the action and reaction section, namely that the passive dimension of the causal substance is produced, suffered as Gewalt, violence, by the active dimension of the same causal substance, by the Macht. It is, as he puts it here, passivity posited through its own activity. It's a paradoxical phrase, right? Passivity is produced through activity, its own activity, not the activity of something else. So his argument in action and reaction was that the passive substance and the active substance are not two different substances. They're not two different substances. They're one substance, two different dimensions of one substance, whereby the passive substance is produced in its own activity. Now, he then draws, once again, on the language of condition to develop that point, the point here about passivity and the activity of the causal substance. He says here, causality is conditioned and conditioning. Yeah, right at the bottom of 503, the last three lines up from the bottom. Causality is conditioned and conditioning. It's both conditioned, passive, and conditioning, active. As conditioning, it is passive, but it equally is so as condition. It's both of those. This conditioning, or passivity, is the negation of the cause through itself, and that it makes itself essentially into an effect. It makes itself essentially into an effect, and is cause precisely for that reason. There is no cause outside of producing an effect. So causal substance is passive. The causal substance is passive in that it suffers the violence of the activity of the cause producing effects. In that sense, the passive dimension of the causal substance is conditioning in that it is presupposed by the activity of the cause. The passive conditions the active. and it is conditioned by the activity of this production. The passive is conditioned by the active. Focusing on the conditioning aspect, that the passive conditions or is presupposed by the active, Hegel here contends that the passive substance is here the effect of the active substance. Passive substance is the effect, product, production of the active substance. The passive is the reaction, the effect to the action of the active substance. This conditioning, this presupposing passivity, is the cause then negating itself through itself. One cause doing the work. It's self-negation. The active cause produces itself as passive, as an effect of its own self-generating activity. Put somewhat more directly, the cause is produced as an effect of its own activity. The cause is produced as an effect of its own activity. The cause is the effect of producing an effect, and therefore the cause is, we could say, though you won't find this in Hegel, so please don't go looking for it, it's not there, but I do think it captures what he's trying to say, that the cause is a secondary or after effect of the activity of producing or causing an effect. So he's so pushed this logical entailment that there is no effect without a cause, and there's no cause without an effect, to say, well, then that means, really, that once you produce an effect, and only in producing an effect, do you then produce, as a kind of secondary effect, the cause. So we used to think the cause is primary. The cause is secondary. It's an after effect of producing an effect. Here's the way Hegel formulates it. This is on page 504, 2-3 lines down from the top. He writes, reciprocity of action. You see that in italics there? It's just reciprocity. Reciprocity is therefore only causality itself. The cause not only has an effect, but in the effect, there's a little bit of translation problem here, so let me just go back and re-say that. So reciprocity is therefore only causality itself. The cause does not just have an effect. But in the effect, it, that is the cause, stands as cause in relationship with itself. You have refers as cause back to itself. Literally, it stands in relation to itself. So it's not just the cause has an effect, it's the cause is produced in the production of the effect. Reciprocity thus names nothing other than the self-generative, self-relational, absolute negativity that produces this cause precisely in and through, and thus is an after or secondary effect of, producing the effect. So manifestation is the manifesting not of something, but the production of both effect and the cause. And the cause is really secondary in the process. That then is the immanence of the moments of the relation, possibility, substance, cause, actuality, accident, effect, thought wholly and completely now within the process of absolute necessity, accidentality, actuosity, power, violence, causation. Paragraph 3 then, which is what begins, causality has therefore returned to its absolute concept. Next sentence down on page 504. Paragraph 3 then really does nothing more than spell out this structure of the process of causation as reciprocity. The central point is that what we see with the advent of reciprocity is the elevation of necessity, which is always what this process has been, it's the process of necessity, absolute necessity. It's the elevation of that to freedom, causality that has come to or attained the concept itself, as he calls it. But how so? How has it attained that status? How has necessity been raised to freedom? Hegel makes the point by comparing real or relative necessity and reciprocity. In relative necessity, recall, the actual is dependent or contingent on the possible inherent in a prior state of affairs for its very existence. One event or state of affairs arises as the result of the actualization of the real possibilities contained or present in a prior state of affairs. The events or state of affairs are free actualities that in relative necessity stand over against one another, so they stand separate from one another. distinct as conditions and conditioned, grounds and grounded. In this sense, necessity is their inner identity. That's what binds them together. This current state of affairs wouldn't be what it is without its dependency on a prior state of affairs and the possibility contained within it from which it derived. So it's their inner identity, and that necessity is that which binds these two sets of free actualities together, holds the concrete possibilities in the one to the concrete actualities that realize them in the other. But causality is the manifestation of this relative inner necessity, because it takes up this necessity and negates its mere inwardness, its reflective shine of substantial otherness, the way he puts it here, and posits it instead as the movement of self-generating causality. Necessity is thereby elevated to freedom. It just is what that process is. It's not just the modal connection between them, it's what literally produces them both. So one state of affairs gives rise to another state of affairs, not really as two separate free actualities, but as two moments within the process of causality itself. When the second state of affairs arises, the effect, it produces the first state of affairs as a state of affairs, as a cause. So freedom thus designates here clearly not the freedom of the will, whether Willkür or Wille, but nothing other than the self-relating ontological process of causation, absolute necessity, manifestation, wherein both cause and effect are generated, and more precisely, the cause is generated precisely in the process of producing the effect, self-determination in and through and by means of self-negation. Here's the way he puts it on 504. This is the end of the first full paragraph on 504. He writes, in reciprocity. Let's see if I can find it here. Yeah. So the paragraph begins, causality has therefore returned to its absolute concept. It's the third paragraph of the section. Look down after the hyphen, slash, what do you want to call it there? In the reciprocity of action, so in reciprocity. Originative causality displays itself as arising from its negation, from passivity, and as passing away into it, as a becoming. So this is one of those moments where Hegel's going back and saying, this is always what we've been trying to think. This is always what we've been after. We've been after with becoming. He's now going to invoke shining, all of the process terms. In the reciprocity of action, originative causality, that which gives birth to everything. Originative causality is that which engenders everything else. Displays itself as arising from its negation, from passivity, and as passing away into it, as a becoming, but in such a way that this becoming is at the same time equally only shining. The transition into otherness is reflection into itself. Negation, that is the ground of the cause, is its positive rejoining, reconnecting with itself. So Hegel's point here is that, look, since the third page of the logic, we've been talking about how being falls into nothing, nothing falls into being, and the name for that collapsing of each into one another is becoming. There's that process that's been with us, we've been trying to think. We always think it in relational terms. We've thought of it in shining, right? Reflective terms. The truth of being is essence. It reflects itself back into essence. We've been looking about it in shining itself forth in appearance and manifestation. All those are the terms we've used, the words we've used to try to capture this process. He says, that's what we're at again now. That's what this is. That's what causality is that process. And what we've learned is that it engenders itself. It produces itself literally in producing its effect. So paragraph 4, in reciprocity of action, therefore necessity and causality have disappeared. In paragraph 4, then, we have a summary statement that spells out how both modalities of reflection, that is necessity and contingency, are in reciprocity elevated into freedom. Absolute necessity and absolute contingency just are reciprocity in self-determination, that is, self-determination in and through self-negation, self-othering. Then paragraph 5, that's that paragraph I read earlier. We're finally back to it. Concludes the objective logic and makes the transition to the subjective logic by laying out, for the first time in the book, as I mentioned earlier, the logic of that generative process process of the concept that is the concept, that is truly immanent to the process itself rather than still in relational formulation. So how does that work? Well, let's walk through that one more time, see if we can now begin to unpack those dense phrasings that he had used to try to define each of the moments. He writes this, it, so we're back to the bottom line on 504, but on the contrary, it, let's see where I'm at. It differentiates, so he's talking about absolute substance. It differentiates itself on the one hand into the totality. We know this is the totality of universality. What does the totality of universality mean? He says, the heretofore passive substance. So what was bearing the accidents? That is originary as the reflection out of determinate in itself, as simple whole, which contains its positiveness in itself and is positively identical therein with itself. So it's just the bearer. Right? It's the mere self-relational bearer of this process. This is the universal. We'll come back to this very minimal, austere definition of universality. It just means nothing other than self-relation. There's nothing to it. There's no content to it. It's just self-relation. On the other hand, it differentiates itself into what? Into the totality, what now, of the individual, it's the singular. Well, what's that? He says, the hitherto causal or active substance. So here's this passive substance, active substance they started using in active and reactive, being played out. How so? Remember, the passive substance was what was taken for granted, what's presupposed, and then it was acted upon. That's what the active substance does. But now the active substance is the individual moment. So he says, the hitherto causal or active substance, that is the reflection also out of determinateness in itself, into the negative determinateness, which is posited just as the determinateness identical with itself, equally as a whole, but posited as negativity identical with itself. So here's become other than itself. It determines itself as other, negates itself. So there's the two moments. So the passive substance is universality, substance that is generated out of determinateness in itself as a simple whole. And then the active substance is a moment here, but that's the individual, the singular, substance that is also generated out of determinateness in itself and is also at the same time a whole, but posited not simply as self-identity, but as self-negation, self-differentiation. Well, what's that determinateness in itself? He keeps referring to that in both cases. He says both of them come out of determinateness in itself. Where do we get determinateness? Where did determination come from? It doesn't come from the passive side. It doesn't come from the active side. That seems to be what the result is. The passive side seems to be where we begin the process. Where do we get this determinateness out of in itself? He said both universality, that is the passive substance, and singular, the individual, active substance, derive from that. So what is that determining or differentiating that is the absolute itself, in which universality and the individual are its liminal moments? Well, he tells us. This, their simple identity, is particularity. Particularity. Which holds in immediate unity from the singular, the moment of determinateness, and from the universal, the moment of reflection in itself. So it's what engenders determination. It's what fulfills the universal's emptiness and gives it concretion, gives it determinacy, and fulfills itself, completes itself in the individual. Particularity, or as we'll see the term better used in the subjective logic, particularization. Think always of particularity as a particularization, as a process. Is the unity or identity of the moments of universality and the singular. It makes possible the self-relational identity that is universality, the concrete determinacy that is the singular. So, if you think, he's about to call this the concept, you would normally say, well, the concept's the universal. The concepts are universal. Right? So that's what he's going to do. But notice, he's setting this up where the concept really is defined by particularization. It's got a moment of universality, absolutely. It's got a moment of individuality, absolutely it does. But what really defines it is neither one nor the other, but what both of them are the liminal moments of, which is particularization, determination. So particularity or particularization makes possible the self-relational identity that is universality and the concrete determinist that is the singular. The concept is freedom, and freedom is self-relation in and through self-negation. And this ontological process is articulated by these three moments of universality, particularity, and singularity, individuality. The logic immanent to the generative process that is the concept. So again, we come back to this line, these three totalities, it's talking about universality, particularity, individuality, or singularity, are therefore one and the same reflection. They're not three separate totalities, they're one and the same reflection. That as negative relation to itself, that's what particularization is, differentiates itself into both of these other two totalities, the universality, the totality of singularity, individuality. But as in a completely transparent difference. So they're not separable from one another, they're all parts of one process. Namely into the determinate simplicity, or into the simple determinateness, which is their one and the same identity. This is the concept, the realm of subjectivity, or freedom. So the logic, therefore, finally captures here, in this moment, this is Hegel's claim, the process of determinate negation as a process. Not in terms of its relations that it engenders from it, but in terms of the process that it is on its own terms. We've named it becoming, we've named it infinity in its qualitative and quantitative guises, we've named it positing, we've called it reflection, we've called it appearance, we've called it absolute necessity and contingency, we've called it manifestation. All of that is the movement of particularization, of self-differentiation, that generates both universality as self-relational identity and singularity as concrete determinateness. That process is the concept, it is what he means by subjectivity, and it is freedom. So we could in a sense say, well then the concept is just the logic of particularization that engenders universality and individuality as its moments. That's right. That's exactly what he's just argued. But how does that work? What's the rule by which that operates by? That's the question that we're going to be grappling with the rest of the course. So to begin that journey, let's remind ourselves of just a couple of things. First of all, let's remind ourselves of what a concept is, right? Because we're about to be far from it. But let's not lose track of what, the common folk call a concept. So let's go to our best common folk recorder and dictionarian of the common folk, intellectually philosophical common folk, and that's Kant, right? So Kant tells us in the first critique that a begriff comes from begreifen, to grasp something, to comprehend something. That's what a concept is, which means the concept to comprehend or grasp, and it literally derives from greifen, to grasp something. So begriff standardly means that which is common to several objects. They're, as Kant puts it, they're universal representation. Now, Hegel knows that definition like the back of his hand. He well knows what a concept is. He knows that a concept is standardly understood to be a common representation. It's what several things have in common. When you're talking about chair, you don't mean a particular chair, you mean that feature that all things that are chairs have in common. Their common representation. That's their concept. Hegel well knows that usage of the term. He's not mistaken by saying, I think the concept is really, this is what it's always meant. No, that's what it's always meant. He knows it very, very well. That's why he starts by telling you, in the material we're going to read for next week, he starts by telling you, look, to talk about the concept in the way I've already talked about it, at the end, that last paragraph that we just went through, and we said it was defined in terms of universality, particularizing itself, and individuality. Yeah, we're going to have to earn to call it that, earn the right to be entitled to call that the concept. Why would we call that the concept? So he begins the section, right? He begins the entirety of the subjective logic with this famous section called the concept of the concept, where he acknowledges, I know this is not your standard view of a concept, but it is what we mean by concept. Here's what we're going to mean by it here. And he gives several definitions of concept here. And I want to just focus on one of them. So we didn't read this, I didn't assign this for today, so please don't get freaked out about this. But on page 508, of the concept in general, this is what I mean by the concept of the concept, right? Of the concept in general. He's acknowledging here that you can talk about this, the notion of concept in a variety of different ways, and it has been talked about in a variety of different ways. But here's what he wants to say about it. Look, he says, just after the title of the concept in general, what the nature of the concept is cannot be given right away. Thanks. Why couldn't you do that? It'd be nice if you could do that. No. Not any more than the concept of any other subject matter. Okay, fine. Then he says, drop down. Now the concept is to be regarded indeed not just as a subjective presupposition, not just something we have in our minds, but as absolute foundation. Right? The truth of being is essence, the truth of essence is concept. So we're now to the retrogressive foundation of all things. The concept is the foundation of all things. But it cannot be the latter except to the extent that it has made itself into one. That's kind of like giving and taking at the same time, right? He gives you, oh, it's an absolute foundation. But the only way it's an absolute foundation is if it's a self-forming foundation. It's a self-grounding foundation. Anything abstractly immediate is indeed a first, but as an abstraction it is rather something mediated, the foundation of which, if it is to be grasped in its truth, must therefore first be sought. And this foundation will indeed be something immediate, but an immediate which has itself made itself such by the sublation of mediation. From this aspect, the concept is at first to be regarded simply as the third. So here's his first attempt to help you. What do we mean by the concept? It's the third to being in essence, to the immediate being, and to reflection, essence. Being and essence are therefore the moments of its becoming. But the concept is their foundation. So we've been working our way literally backwards, if you want to think about it that way. Right? We've been regressing back into the ground, moving back into what's most fundamental, though it literally follows. We've not been progressing in our standard sense of progression up towards that which is most highest. We've been moving back into that which is most fundamental. But the concept is their foundation and truth as the identity into which they have sunk and in which they are contained. So this isn't a third like, and then there's this other thing. This is a third in the sense of it's the truth of the two that preceded it. They are contained in it. They are contained in it because the concept is their result. There's the retrogressive grounding language, right? That which follows from, that which is the result, is actually the truth of that which it followed from. But no longer as being in essence, these are determinations which they have only insofar as they have not yet returned into the identity, which is their unity. That is, insofar as they haven't been thought through the concept. Now that's a hint. It's a very buried one. But that's a hint that, by the way, once we figure out what the concept is on its own terms, we're going to need to rethink what being in essence are. We'll say, we just spent 500 pages thinking through what being in essence are. That's true. But now that we see them, what their foundation is, the concept. Once we see what the concept is on its own terms, we got to work our way back out. And think, well, what are they? What are being in essence now, given what the concept is? We see what the concept is, given what they were. But now we need to reverse that thought process and think through what they are. That's why, strangely enough, the subjective logic starts with a discussion of the concept, but then turns to a discussion of objectivity. Objectivity, I think, is best read as doing precisely this, rethinking being in essence through the logic of the concept itself. Hence, the objective logic, which treats of being in essence, constitutes in truth, here's that line I referred to earlier, the genetic exposition of the concept. The genesis, right? The genesis of the concept. It's what follows out from but it's always unpacking it. More precisely, substance already is real essence, or essence insofar as it is united with being and has stepped into actuality, Consequently, the concept has substance for its immediate presupposition. Substance has implicitly what the concept is explicitly. The dialectical movement of substance through causality and reciprocal affection is thus the immediate genesis of the concept, by virtue of which its becoming is displayed, its conceptual becoming, right? And ultimately its own transformative process itself, the logic of that. But the meaning of its becoming, like that of all becoming, is that it is the reflection of something which passes over into its ground, and that the at first apparent other into which this something has passed over constitutes the truth of the latter. Thus, the concept is the truth of substance, and since necessity is the determining relational mode of substance, freedom reveals itself to be the truth of necessity and the relational mode of the concept. That's just him reminding you what he demonstrated on page 505. Now, what he does in the rest of this discussion is try to unpack what he thinks the concept can basically mean at a very general level. And he links it back up again to freedom, to other things that we'll talk about next week when we move through this. But the one I want to focus on for the moment is the one he lays out on 514. So take a look at the top of 514. This is page 16 in the German, and volume 12 now in the critical edition. He says the foregoing, so all this, these are preliminary remarks. These are non-systematic. This is polemical stuff. He's, talked about Spinoza here and other, so he's doing this kind of polemical relation, comparative stuff, none of the systematic derivations. He says this: the foregoing is to be regarded as the concept of the concept. To some, it may seem to depart from the common understanding of concept. Yeah. And they might require that we indicate how our result fits with other ways of representing or defining it. So, could we please get how is this a common representation? Right? Because it doesn't sound like anything you're talking about is common representation. Doesn't sound like that at all. Why would you even call that the concept? Why is that the term to use? But for one thing, this cannot be an issue of proof based on the authority of ordinary understanding. In the science of the concept, the content and determination of the latter can be proven solely on the basis of the immanent deduction which contains its genesis, and such a deduction lies behind us. So, in a sense, I've already shown you what I can show you about that. But then look down at the next paragraph. I confine myself to one remark which may contribute to the comprehension of the concept here developed and facilitate one's way into it. Now, the reason why I'm focusing on this is because this passage is famous for giving us an insight into what Hegel means by the concept, and it's been the locus for a lot of exegetical treatment of the logic as an elaboration of the conditions of self-consciousness. That's really what's going on here. But look at what he says. The concept, so that's what we're supposed to be talking about. Right? But then he puts this little caveat in. When it has progressed to a concrete existence which is itself free. The question, of course, is, have we gotten there yet? He says, is none other than the I, our pure self-consciousness. People go, oh, that's what he means by concept. He means the ego. He means self-consciousness. Now we can get going. Right? Because I bet he's talking about something then like, Kant said in the B deduction of the first critique, where Kant says, look, the only way I can have an experience of the world, the only way I can have an experience of individual objects in the world is to have an I think attached to every single last one of my representations. I got to think them, right? It has to be possible to think them. But all those I thinks, I got one world, so I got to have one I think that patches all those I thinks together. So there's got to be a synthetic unity of all those apperceptions. Apperceptions is the I think that attaches to all my representations. I got to put all those together. So that's what he means by self-consciousness. That's what the concept is. So this is all one big deduction. That's what Hegel's really doing. It's another version of the B deduction. He's saying, in order for me to have experience of the world, the concept, I got to have all these categories. The categories of being, the categories of essence. That's the way to read this text. But look at what he says. The concept, when it has progressed to a concrete existence which is itself free, is none other than the I, or pure self-consciousness. True. I have concepts. That is determinate concepts. So there's Hegel sort of throwing you a bone. I know what concepts are. I have them. We make use of them. But the I is the pure concept itself. There's the distinction he wants to draw. I have concepts, but the I is the concept itself. The concept that has come into determinate existence, essentially. It is fair to suppose, therefore, when we think of the fundamental determinations which constitute the nature of the I, that we are referring to something familiar, that is a commonplace of ordinary thinking. But the I is in the first place purely self-relating unity. Self-relating unity. And is this not immediately, but by abstracting itself from all determinateness and content, and withdrawing into the freedom of unrestricted equality with itself? As such, it is universality, a unity that is unity with itself only by virtue of its negating relating. It's negative relating, which appears as abstraction, and because of it contains all determinants within itself as dissolved. In the second place, the I just is as immediately self-relating negativity, singularity, absolute relating, determinateness that stands opposed to anything other and excludes it, individual personality. This absolute universality, which is just an immediate absolute singularization, being in and for itself, which is immediate, which is absolute positiveness and being in and for itself only by virtue of its unity with the positiveness. This universality constitutes the nature of the I and the concept. Neither the one nor the other can be comprehended unless these two just given moments, universality and singularity, are grasped at the same time, both in their abstraction and in their perfect unity. And he tells you in the next paragraph, Kant thought this. Kant did know this. Here's what Kant said. Kant went beyond the external relation of the understanding as the faculty of concepts and of the concept to the I. It is one of the profoundest and most and truest insights to be found in the particular reason that the unity which constitutes the essence of the concept is recognized as the original synthetic unity of apperception, the unity of the I thing, or self-consciousness. So there it looks like Hegel's given it. Right? Hegel's saying, if you want to know what the concept is, Kant thought it with the synthetic unity of apperception. That's what he was thinking. But that's not the ego, as we understand continually, conventionally, the ego. Right? It's not the mind that thinks. It's the I think that attaches to all representations that are attached to each other so that you have the oneness of experience. That's not your ego, that's not my ego, that's the transcendental ego as such. And Hegel is saying, that's the way you have to think about that. You have to think about that as a process. So, is that the concept? Yeah. But is it the concept insofar as it's just an ego? No. It's an ego. It's the concept insofar as it's a process of synthetic determination. It produces itself as a unity. So, I suggest to you that rather than, finally, Hegel's given us something we can make sense of the concept with. He's given us something we can compare it with. But then he's about to walk you through what the necessity of that comparison really entails. And that is this process that he thinks Kant was trying to articulate, that Kant didn't articulate terribly well. All right. I think that's enough for now. That leaves us with some time to talk. What do you think? Does this make some sense? It's all preposterous. Where are we at? We had a whole break to think about how completely ludicrous this whole thing is. Where are you at? Good job.
Just a quick clarification of this. So is he then saying he's comparing the concept to apperception in Kant, meaning that it is the thing which is doing the unifying? That is, the concept is something which is unifying, something not external to it, but...
So think about Kant says many things about the synthetic unity of apperception, but just the rough argument that I outlined is, I think, sufficient to make Hegel's point, which is that Kant's claim is that you can't experience something unless there's an I think that attaches to that experience. It's not yours. Right? There's no I think unless there's no encountering of something. There's no representation of something as belonging to you unless the I think attaches to it. Okay. There's no experience without self-awareness. That's basically the claim. So apperception is a term that was taken from Leibniz, right? Where Leibniz means you have these little small thoughts, perceptions. And one of the perceptions you have is that you always attach the I think along to every perception that you have. So Kant's saying, right, I can't have an experience of anything unless I attach the I think to it. Furthermore, I can't have an experience of the world, and I do have an experience of not just individual things, so I don't just have this representation, that representation, this representation, the I think here, the I think there, and the I think over there. Those I thinks all belong to one another because the world belongs together. So it's one world, so there has to be one I think. All these I thinks then have to be synthesized, it's synthetic unity, put together. Right? So there's an operation of synthesizing, differentiating, and synthesizing that makes possible the experience of the world. Otherwise, I don't have the world. And this is Henry Allison famously talking about the B-deduction commentator said, there's a fundamental principle here for Kant. One world, it takes one to know one, right? And if there's one world, then there has to be one I think, right, ultimately. And that has to be stitched together. And that synthetic operation of building all that together, that's what Hegel's talking about, right? That's the generative processing that generates one world for one subject. And so in that sense, it's a kind of Fichtean inflected view of the transcendental unity of apperception that Hegel is giving. It's a very active transcendental unity of apperception. If you ask most Kantians, they'll say that's a formal principle. There's no activity really going on there. Right? They don't like it when you start talking those terms. Right? So let's keep it all sensible to say, well, that's an abstract principle of the matter. But Fichte clearly thought about it as an activity. Right? That's where he got positing from. This is what Hegel's building on, is that insight. He's saying, I'm trying to think that same process, but not confine it just to subjectivity. So yeah, in that sense, he thinks that that's a process going on there that's not extraneous. It's not imposed from without, it's immanent within. But it's immanent within this construction of experience itself. And that's what makes it like the concept. And he says it is the concept, but it's the concept in its most highly concrete existence, which ain't what the science of logic is about. Right? So I take that to be a warning note, right? To say, if you want to talk about it at a higher level, the level of epistemology, then here's how we know the world. And we could call this the concept at work there. But we're at a much lower level than that. We're not talking yet knowledge. We're not talking experience. We're talking about things existing at all. I'm sorry, I cut you off. Is that?
No. I mean, that's really helpful. I think my problem was it's hard not to think of it as something even slightly outside everything else that was previously discussed.
It does, and the example clearly is that, right? It's him saying,
Yeah, right.
Look, I'm going to use concept as something strange. Is there any predecessor in the history for using concept in this weird way? And he says, well, yeah, if you'll buy my weird, understanding of Kant. And it is weird, but it's not completely fabulous, right? It's not completely strange, because he is on to something in Kant, right? Kant was trying to think about how there is this activity going on that constructs our experience. This is what Kant called transcendental imagination. That constructs our experience. He's much more explicit about this in the A deduction than he is in the B deduction. That's why Heidegger likes the A deduction rather than the B deduction. There's stories about that. But that processing of experience is what he's saying. That's what we're getting to here at the ontological level. That's even more fundamental than the epistemological, experiential level that's being that content analysis is running at. Other comments? Yeah. Julie.
First time I heard the concept was in the philosophy of nature, so I keep going there.
Yeah.
So I just very broadly like Hegel speaks of like the concept in plants and stuff.
Yep.
So, and we're talking about like how he's kind of zooming out of the more subjective idealist view. So how do we like? I guess I don't know what I'm asking, but like, how do I we're studying the concept as such here, and then concept, like how are we studying them differently here versus the philosophy of nature?
Yeah. So, I mean, as you know, he famously defines the subject matter of the philosophy of nature is the concept in externality. So he wants to say there that here's an account of the concept. It's not divorced from the concept. You know, it's not something that stands outside the concept. It is something that is generated by the concept itself, nature, and then we have to understand what the concept is in order to understand how it could generate that. So it's not reducible to, or it's not simply identifiable with self-consciousness. Self-consciousness is one form of it, but nature is another form of the concept. I think that means we have to have a conception of the concept that's rich and robust enough to allow us to talk about both. To talk about it as generative of experience, but also as generative of nature itself. And it to be nature itself. It's not something other stands over against nature, it's something that is within nature itself. That's the first stab at it. Is that helpful at all? Or no?
Yeah.
So we're dealing with it at a level here. I mean, he's trying to give you a comparison, right? But the way he's going to talk about the concept in the science of logic directly is as nothing other than this process that is not yet natural or spiritual.
So like, it says like comes to like zum Dasein gekommen. Like
Say that again?
Like it says like comes to like existence, like the concept
Yeah.
comes into existence.
Yeah.
So that's just like still within the science of logic, and it does another thing in the philosophy of nature, and it does another thing in the philosophy of space. It's just different ways of coming into existence, or?
I don't think there are different ways of coming into existence. I think there are different dimensions of existence.
So this is like the first, like, okay.
So it's the difference between asking these two questions. It's about I don't know if this is about the best I can do with it, but it's one way of trying to grapple with it. It's the difference between asking the question, what is it to be as such? I don't care what we're talking about. Tables, chairs, human beings, stock markets, mountains, anything. Insofar as it is, what is it to be? And that's what this book is about. It takes away all those specific determinations, and we get down to the bedrock of just what is it to be, as such, in any sense of the word. Literally, in any sense of the word. So that's ontology. That's a different question than what is it to be naturally, which is what the philosophy of nature is about. What is it to be as a natural entity? Not just to be as an entity, but what is it to be as a natural entity? Now, clearly those two questions are related, right? What is it to be as such is arguably the underpinnings for the more restricted scope question, what is it to be as a natural entity? So natural entities have to fulfill all the qualifications for being as such, or they couldn't be at all. But then there's additional qualifications, I'm using terms very loosely here, qualifications for them to be as natural beings. The same thing you could say is true for those to be as spiritual beings. Right? They would at least have to be, they at least have to be natural. What more is required of them in order to be spiritual? So that's one way of delineating between the three domains and the three, call it forms of existence. Do things come into existence differently? Fundamentally, no, but at the ontological level, but do they have a natural form of that existence? Yeah. Do they have a spiritual form of that existence? They can have. And that's what he's elucidating, as far as I can see, in those two domains, those two accounts, vis-a-vis or over against what's going on in the logic itself. You want to come back to that?
Yeah, so, yeah, my initial confusion, I guess now I realized, was like more linguistic. Like, he uses the word, like, the concept in over and over again in the science, in the philosophy of nature, as if it's like a thing on its own,
Yeah.
besides like the natural part.
Yeah.
So that's why I was like, oh, is the concept like this Platonic, like, you know, like the almost like part of nature participates in the concept or something? But it's not like, it's more like a process.
Yep.
And the nature is kind of just happening on top of the process that's the concept.
It is that process. I mean,
It's
on
the
top of,
concept.
bothers me a little bit, because then you
Yeah,
get,
but he speaks differently, like about, he says like plants, and then he says the concept, so I'm like, how do you like unite
the-
that like this?
because the plant just is the concept.
Yeah, but he still used the word the concept, that's why I was so confused, but
Well, what term should he be using?
it's just it's like the same word as here,
Yeah,
so
I'm not
why
sure.
does I mean, it's okay, it's
No,
just
no, no.
like a confusion that I have.
No, I'm trying to hear the confusion and hear what's at issue in the confusion.
I need like I need to bring the text with me, but a lot of the time you read the philosophy of nature, it says, oh, the concept does this.
Yeah.
The concept has become this, and it's like, what do you, like, you were talking about like plants like, more concretely just now, and then you're talking about the concept like in abstraction now. So what is going on there?
Yes.
And it's always very poetic, but at the same time you don't really know what's going on.
Yeah, I think that once he thinks he's earned the right to talk about the concept doing things, which at this point we've worked our way back to the concept, and now we're trying to figure out the logic of the concept itself. But once we figure out that logic on its own, then and only then can we start talking about the concept having its own, let's call it broadly speaking, its own agency. I mean, roughly what he's arguing back to, right, is that the concept is the agent by which everything is what it is. That's what he's saying. Right? That's what the argument of the science of logic is. And it's a self-causing agency. That's what he's talking about. But it's only once he's figured out or worked out the logic of that self-generating agency, that self-generating power. It's only then that he feels entitled to be able to attribute that the concept does X, the concept does Y, which he does, you're quite right, all over the philosophy of nature. And at that point, it's because he's demonstrated that the concept is, roughly speaking, two things. And we've got to see him demonstrate both these. One, I think he's already demonstrated. The other, we've got to see him actually establish. So the one thing he's got to show us is that the concept is real, not just ideal. So we don't just have concepts in our mind. That would be ideal. The concept is out there in the world. It's real. It doesn't belong to me, it doesn't belong to you, it's not in our heads. It's actually in the world itself. So it's real in that sense. So it's as Platonist as anything can be without it being transcendent. Right? So it's out there in the world. So that's the first thing. And I think he's already there. Because that's what, if you buy what we did with causality today, he's not saying, and that's the way we see causality. There's no caveats like the Kantian move. This is the way we must take causality because of our, finite structure of our ability to know. Then here's the way the world has to be. That's not the argument. The argument is here's what causality is in itself. So if that's the case, then the concept is this process in itself. So it's real. That's the first thing. The second thing is that the concept is productive. That the right way to think of the concept, we haven't got there yet. This is to be shown in the subjective logic. It's really one of the central discoveries or finds or proofs of the subjective logic, is that the right way to think about the concept is not as an abstract class, but as a generative species. That it generates its own specification from itself. It's only once you've got that established and the logic of that worked out that you're then entitled to say, I think, that the concept does things in nature. Up to that point, you don't have that. You can talk about natural processes, and that must be the concept at work. But that's not what he does in the philosophy of nature. What he wants to say is, these natural processes are the concept at work. That's what the concept does. It produces time and space, matter, and then eventually the life process itself. Is that?
Yeah, so he's using the word like concept in the philosophy of nature to look at like phenomena that we can experience, but to identify something that's logical. Like he's using the word to kind of break apart what we see and identify them.
Exactly. So there's an experiential dimension to nature, right? We're familiar with, we see, we experience, we encounter. But there's also an ontological dimension of nature that is not under our control. It's not a matter of we see it. It doesn't just correspond to the way we need it to be, sort of the Kantian view of nature, but it actually is this way itself. Because the concepts are working it. Not because we're working it, but because the concept itself is working. The concept doesn't belong to us. That's why this notion that it has to be real is so important. Is that useful?
Yeah, it clarifies. Yeah.
Ken, I think you were
Just going off this, is it worth, can it be said then that insofar as the concept is, as he talks about in the philosophy of nature, it is still concrete existence, but it doesn't possess the sort of pure self-conscious aspect that the I, at least insofar as it's the concept here, possesses? That it's not, it doesn't understand itself. I don't know if that's a useful way to put it.
Does nature self-understand?
Nature doesn't.
Yeah.
That would be.
Yeah, and this is one of the distinctions between he and, say, Herder, for example, but also, more importantly, Schelling. So both Schelling and Herder will say that nature has a dimension of its own self-awareness. And Schelling, depending on which moment you catch Schelling in, will say, and this is what we are. We're nature's awareness of itself. So we're the point of inflection, right? Human beings are the point of inflection where natural organisms are no longer just merely natural organisms anymore. They're the organisms that turn back and are able to articulate their own formulation, their awareness of themselves. So that's what self-awareness is in the natural world. We're that. And Hegel wants to say, this isn't a matter of, let's figure out the complexification of nature up to the status of human beings, which is how Schelling runs the account of nature. We need to just figure out what nature is on its own terms. Not what it is for us and how we're the pinnacle of it, just what it is on its own terms. And let the logic, let the minimal logical determinations that unfold as they unfold, rather than, how do we make sense of how we're aware of that, which is one of the things that Schelling's interested in trying to do. I'm not condemning that. I'm just saying it's a different approach than Hegel's taking. Carolyn.
Yeah, I have two pretty closely related questions that I assume we'll get to throughout the order, but they would just be like, why is the doctrine of the concepts a subjective logic?
Yeah.
And then what does Hegel mean by subjectivity, basically? Because it seems not conventional.
Not what we normally mean by it.
Yeah.
Did you have something else?
No,
That's enough.
That's it, yeah.
So we'll look at passages. So you're right, we're going to come to this. But I think it's already fair to, why is this called the subjective logic and that's the objective logic? I mean, that's worth just asking at that point. One answer to that is, well, look, particularly if you look in the first chapter, by that I mean the chapter that's referred to as section 1, subjectivity, the concept. Subjectivity chapter, right, the subjectivity section, is filled with what? Concept, judgment, and syllogism. Sort of the standards of the logic of the time. So, you had to wait, 520 pages, but now we finally got actual logic in the logic. Right? And in that sense, someone so this is not a satisfying answer. I'll give you a slightly more maybe satisfying answer to it in just a second. But one reason is because it looks like it's talking about the traditional subject matter of reasoning. We form concepts, we put concepts together in judgments, we put judgments together into syllogisms. Here's the rules by which we do that, and that's what the first section is about. It's about standard logic stuff, right? Stuff like you would find in Aristotle, right? In the medieval appropriations of Aristotle, scholastic logic. So it looks like it's talking about the rules of reasoning, the rules of subjectivity in that broad sense. But what messes you up, right, is, well, okay, that's the title of the first section. The title of the second section is objectivity. Why are we still calling it the subjective logic? And then the final section is called the idea. It's not, and we'll quickly find out, it's not the idea of the human mind. So these don't like to go together with the broader characterization. So the reason why I think it's called the subjective logic is because it is talking about the concept, and the concept is usually thought of to do with subjectivity. Because we have concepts, we're the users of concepts, and we can say that one of the fundamental characterizations of subjectivity, namely the synthetic unity of apperception, is a way of thinking about subjectivity, and it's the concept. So all those are ways of doing it. But it's pretty clear that the way he uses the term subject and subjectivity in this book is not to refer to human subjectivity. What he standardly means by it is something that's abstract. Something that's abstract over against something that is concrete, which is what the objective logic is really about. So I think it's formal. That's really where it goes with it. It's formal. So we're going to talk about universality, particularity, individuality. We're going to talk about a variety of different kinds of judgments, put those judgments together in a syllogism. All those are going to be formal. Right? They're going to be rules for the relating of concepts into judgments, judgments into syllogisms. It's rule-based forms. Whereas we've been talking about like content, causality, and things, and properties, and qualities, and what. No, now we're talking about the rules that govern this process itself, and those are forms, logical forms. And then those are going to entail objectivity. So he's going to say that subjectivity means formal, he says this at one point, and that entails this movement into objectivity. But this is all about the movement of the concept itself, so that's why I think he calls it all the subjective logic. It's all about this movement of the concept, where the concept has to be thought of in this very strange, odd way, where it's not restricted just to human subjectivity, but it is ultimately that. Is that useful?
Yeah, that's.
But I want you to hold on to that question, because the explanation I just gave you, I think can work for what he says about subjectivity when he initially says this first section is subjective, and then the second section is objective, and he's trying to make that distinction. I think it works for that. But I still don't think it works for the master claim about why is the whole subjective logic called the subjective logic.
Yeah, I mean, I think my sort of, before I asked the question, like intuition, like the reason I thought of this question was when we started comparing it to the synthetic unity of apperception and thinking about it in relationship to transcendental subjectivity. But yeah, I guess it didn't occur to me that Hegel also would like attribute format, like associate formals, or just form and subjectivity together. But I'll have to think about that. But the other thing, I would say is it seems like the other sections about like teleology and life also are like not so easy for me, at least, to like think about as being part of a subjective logic.
That's right.
Yeah.
And rightly so. Right? I don't think the entire section on objectivity, but certainly not the section on teleology there, and certainly not the section on life that opens the discussion of the idea, sit well with the title of subjective logic, unless you read them, and they've been read this way, unless you read them as the prerequisites for rethinking of what it is to be a subject. And then these are the ingredients that ultimately lead to an account of, which it does, leads to what he calls the idea, the logic as fulfilled is the idea, and that is to be thought of as personality. And then you're up to a kind of subjectivity that's not human subjectivity, it's divine subjectivity, if you want to put it those terms. So the subjective logic is a subjective logic, but not a human subjective logic. It's a divine subjective logic. So then, that's the way some people go up to that extreme with it. Some people want to stop off at species being or something like that. Yeah.
Just to make sure I understood, that qualification on 514, which is the concept of when it has progressed to concrete existence, which is itself free.
Yeah.
You think that's referring to spirit?
I do. I think that's the right way to read that. I think what Hegel's giving you there is, if you want a concrete comparison of this, let me go all the way up to and show you at the level of spiritual being what this looks like. And then let me do a comparison with it there. That's not how it's often been read, right? It's been read without that caveat as saying, no, that's what he's doing here. And that you can profitably read the science of logic as what are the conditions for the possibility of apperception? You need all these concepts, which is a variation of the B-deduction argument and initial critique. It's a convoluted version of it, but it's that. And so this is what, most famously, it's done by Pippin in his book, Hegel's Idealism. That's the argument he's running there, and that's the passage he refers to make that argument.
Well then, can you just quickly say, like, what? So we've already reached freedom.
Yep.
Right? So, why is that freedom not what he's talking about?
Why is that freedom what?
Not what he's talking about here.
What are you talking about where?
In that sentence that I just read, when it has progressed to
Oh.
complete existence, which is
When it's free.
Yeah.
Because I don't think that that freedom is the same freedom he's talking about here. He's talking about a freedom of something that's become concrete.
Right.
It has self-relatedness to itself in and through the world. That's the freedom he's talking about there, which is what he explicitly is talking about in subjective spirit. When you know the world,
Right.
you're free because you come back to yourself in and through being experienced through the world. So it's that freedom. But the freedom we're talking about here is the freedom of the concept.
Right.
It's a freedom that is not one out of relationship to the world. It's in the world itself.
I'm just confused because we also got that freedom through concrete existence.
It produces concrete existence. We didn't get it through it, though. Right? This is the difference, right? Knowledge of it is not the same thing as producing it. I mean, that's roughly the difference, as I understand it. But, I mean, I don't think that's crystal clear what I'm saying either, so please don't misunderstand me. It's like foolish to read it any other way. No, of course not. Show me a passage in Hegel. Foolish to read some, nothing's crystal clear in Hegel as far as I can tell, at least at this point. Other comments? All right, so next week we start on this journey to explicate what we mean by the concept. Hegel's going to say the way you have to understand the concept is to go to, first of all, concepts, universality, particularity, individuality, show how those are related into judgments. The form of S is P, subject is predicate, and those have universe. So he's always talking about how universal particularity and individuality relate to one another. So there it's in judgments, they're related through the copula, the is. And there, eventually he says they have to be related through the syllogism, where the point of relation for the three terms, the three concepts, will be through the middle term. And he's eventually going to claim, strangely as though it is, that everything is a syllogism. Because a syllogism is the ultimate way of understanding what the concept is. The ultimate way of understanding what the concept is. More about that when we get there, but be patient as we go through that. That's where we're headed. Yeah. All right. I'll see you next week. Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Thanks.